So, welcome to Leaders in Real Estate podcast. I'm your host, Nick Carman, and I hope this proves to be a mentor in your pocket for future leaders of real estate, investment, and development professionals. Now, we're going to talk challenges, obstacles, benefits of leadership with the aid of our mentor's own experience. Now, today I'm joined by Megan Creecy-Herman, who is the president of Prologis U.S. West region, responsible for all business activities, including development, acquisitions, and operations. And for a little bit of context, Prologis U.S. West region comprises more than 260 million square feet of assets across key markets from Los Angeles, Inland Empire, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Central Valley, Las Vegas, Denver, and Phoenix. That is quite a mouthful. So, listen, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nick. I'm excited for this conversation, and I'm happy to be here.
So let's get started, shall we? Yeah, just why don't you, I sort of gave the tip of the iceberg sort of intro there, Megan, but just tell us a little bit more about sort of what you're responsible for today, maybe how big this team is of yours, so that we can make this really clear to the audience in terms of what perspective you're coming from.
Sure. So you covered off this sort of geographic area of the West Coast for Prologis. It's we have about 55 billion in assets under management in the West, and it's run by a team of about 220 people. So this leadership conversation that we're having, I think, is very salient to what I do every day around leading large teams to optimal outperformance across the business lines. So you talked about the real estate platform, and I would also say I'm generally responsible for anything that happens in the West Coast, and that can extend to things like some of our other business lines. It's innovation. It's sort of whatever we happen to have going on today.
I mean, those are some ginormous numbers. 260 million square feet, 55 billion under management, 220 employees. We've got a lot of unpacking to go, Megan. But let's wind the clock back. Do you remember when you had your first sense of leadership? Do you remember your first opportunity to lead?
I know that there was one moment. I would say I started in this business when I was right out of undergrad. So I was 21, 22 years old. And I think my first experiences with leadership in general were more influencing without authority. And I would say that I remember, a few times sitting in a job trailer on a development site where maybe I wasn't the oldest one in the room, maybe I didn't have the biggest title, but I remember sort of needing to elicit an outcome. And I would say that some of those experiences are probably the first, I don't know if they're catalytic or just sort of sparks of, there are different ways to go about this. And it all comes back to trying to get the best sort of business performance. So I'd say those are some of the early kind of memories I have around sort of leading, but maybe without direct authority.
It's such a recurring theme. When I ask this question then to our guests, we're going to about people seizing leadership as opposed to being granted or given it. And I think it's such an important lesson for our audience here as future leaders. Do you remember what drove you in those early days?
I think for me, in the beginning of my career, what drove me was wanting to have sort of a tactile work product that I could point to. So that's what drove me into the development side of the business. I wanted to be able to point to something that I had done that was concrete, that was tangible. And I think it was that drive that also then helped me sort of open up my lens to leadership because I understood that while I could achieve success from a transaction perspective or on a particular development, as an individual contributor, I knew eventually that I could achieve more as a leader.
And do you remember sticking in that chapter? What were some of the earliest challenges you'd faced then, Megan?
I think some of the challenges were the things I talked about at the onset relative to the fact that when you're not the leader, when you're not the most senior person, when you don't have the biggest title, you've got to figure out how to get stuff done and to get people to follow you. But it isn't necessarily natural. And maybe they don't overtly think they have to follow you. So your biggest challenges are figuring out a way to get people to listen and follow you without that sort of authority being explicit. And I I raise that issue because I think it's very relevant for some of your new leaders who are listening, right? These sort of mentees that you're trying to reach, because still point back to that fact that I had to figure out how to do that without having seniority and a title. And I think that's made me so much more effective throughout my career as I've gained seniority because I haven't been able to fall back to the, well, you got to listen to me because I say so. Right? If you're falling back on title or seniority, I think you're doing something wrong. And those challenges of saying, okay, well, how do I build trust with this person? How do I respect the fact that maybe they're the subject matter expert, yet I'm responsible for leading us to an outcome or finding success on this project? So I think it was sort of navigating some of that ambiguity in those challenges that were some of the best lessons learned. But
I can't let you get away with not explaining how you do that, though, Megan, because this sounds like a phenomenal sort of lesson here for our guys to hear about. So, how did you get over that? How did you tackle this?
depends on the person. So just like I would say, leadership is not the same for anybody. I personally believe everybody has their own leadership style. And what might be effective with one person might not be effective with someone else. So I think step one is listening. You got to understand who you're leading or who you're trying to sort of move to an outcome, right? You got to listen. You got to understand what motivates them and what their priorities are. And then you have to build trust and credibility. I think those are some of the foundational pieces of understanding how to lead. And then as a follow on, I'd say you also should be asking a lot of questions. If you're trying to learn about how to lead someone, if you're trying to learn about how to motivate them, you've got to do more listening than talking, which I think sometimes for people who maybe need to get to an outcome or are feeling insecure, they do a lot more talking than they should, when in fact you should be listening. And I think leaders more broadly should probably do more listening and sort of being an active listener is something I'm always working at because I'm not short on opinions and I'm not short on things to say. But as the leader, it's about sort of getting that information, supporting the team, and listening more than it is talking a lot of times.
I think that will be a very stark contrast to how a lot of people imagine they should lead, particularly people who haven't got the experience, right? Leading almost by its definition suggests you're out in front. Follow me. I know where I'm going. So I think that's a great lesson, Megan. So let's keep in this sort of earliest chapter then of your career. I want to ask a little bit about the influence other leaders have had on you. What are some of the traits you've most admired, and what are some of the tips or the skills that you've stolen into your own toolkit?
It's funny. I think some of my most challenging bosses have been the most formative because they've showed me how not to do it. And I say that because that was really probably some of my earliest motivation for wanting to become a leader was seeing an opportunity. Because a lot of the things that make us great deal makers, like being, you hinted at motivation, being assertive, being competitive, being sort of dominating, wanting to
Yeah,
win above all else,
yeah.
right?
This
Those are,
almost military general, I think, is such a common sort of stereotype, isn't it?
yes, I think it is. And I think that, when I entered the business more than 20 years ago now, that sort of command and control style leadership
Hmm.
was prevalent, right? That was common. You weren't to be questioned if you were the leader. You were doing all of the talking.
Yeah.
That was what it was. And as I got going in the business and I observed all these traits that were very common amongst myself and my peers, also saw a potential opportunity for me if I could figure out a way to be a good deal maker and be a good leader. And I think sometimes it can be challenging for people because some of the traits, especially in today's environment, that make you a great leader are not necessarily the traits you utilize when you're transacting. So it requires some flexibility and some sort of versatility sometimes for people that could feel in contrast. And it can be difficult because you can't necessarily apply your deal making mindset, your leadership mindset in every setting.
Okay. Okay. I want to bring in a bit of our research now, Megan, because I've asked people who you've worked with for several years now for a little bit of background and just some of the things that you are great at as well. Sitting comfortably.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
So this is bit of research number one. I'm going to read out the quote and then I'm going to ask you how you do this. So Megan has this ability to make people in her team better, including reigniting passions in their career and their leadership responsibilities, which they didn't think they had. How? How do you do this? How do you make this sort of magic wand, sort of waved across people and make them better, improve their stats, light this fire underneath them?
That's first of all, I'm very flattered by whoever gave you that quote. And I would say we talked about the size of my team at
Mm-hmm.
Prologis on the West Coast when we started. And I love complex challenges. I love complex problem solving. One of the reasons I love what I do is I love the ability to figure out how to optimize performance among so many people. And my role and what I love doing is helping people become the best version of themselves. Right? I'm trying to elicit that out in performance. And how I do it is it comes back to some of the things I said I learned at the earliest parts of my career is like to lead people, you have to understand them. You have to understand that each individual is different. A big part of what I do is also helping them not only evaluate themselves, but helping give them the feedback and create the awareness so they can see where their greatest opportunities lie and their greatest development areas. And I would say that's one thing I would absolutely tell your audience, which is you have to be comfortable giving people feedback. You got to be really candid, but the first step is building trust so they can hear you. So, as far as how I do it, it's building trust, making sure people know that I have their back and that we're on the same team and that we're after the same exact thing, which is winning and outperformance and better business outcomes for Prologis and for our team. And then you make sure they know that you're going to work for them uh, as their coach to help them be better. And that way, when you're giving feedback, you're giving constructive feedback. When you're challenging them, saying, "Hey, I think you can do this better," or "This was good, but you missed this," they know that it's coming from the right place. They know that we have a shared goal. And I think people work so much harder and are so much more dedicated to leaders that they know are on the same team. I think that's a big part of it.
Well, I mean, I imagine that's not something that you learn overnight. But clearly as you've developed this huge team, that's obviously something that you are very, very good at. Let's talk about something else you're good at, right? So this was another comment, but from a different source, and I think this is a very related, sort of very similar sort of topic. So Megan's a student of management and shares this with the team and encourages her team to also invest in themselves. And it's infectious in this culture of personal development. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Where's that curiosity come from?
As I said, I want to make people the best versions of themselves.
Yep.
I'm also on the same journey myself. And I think, like I said, I think leadership and people are the most intriguing puzzle that you're never going to solve. And we haven't really touched on the business environment yet, but we are living in a time of tremendous change. It's happening at a very rapid rate. Like, I'm sure you're familiar with the term VUCA, right?
I am not familiar with.
Oh, you're not. Okay, so VUCA is an acronym. It means volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we
Okay.
are living in a VUCA world, right? Do those things sound familiar to you?
Yes. Yep.
Well, Okay. And you look at everything that's happening, you throw AI in the mix even as of late, and you look at the pace of change. You look at technology and what it's done to our business environment, what it's done to our connectivity, how rapidly things are changing and how rapidly you need to move. And when I bring that back to leadership and what that means, you have teams and you have people who have all of this change swirling around them. We don't have a lot of control around some of the external factors that are coming at us at a very quick pace. But what we as leaders can do is we can provide that stability. We can figure out ways to be consistent in how we show up for our teams. And I believe that through sort of leadership that is decisive, candid, yet sort of supportive, trustworthy, I think you can elicit better outcomes, particularly in these environments, which are really complex. So, what drives me is consistent outperformance, being the best leader I can be, and then demonstrating that leadership, great leadership, is the foundation for optimal performance year after year. And I think, challenge me on this, where I think some people get it wrong is they think that being a great deal maker is sort of more important than being a great leader. And or I'll take a great deal maker over somebody who's an effective leader any day. And I would say that works in a strong market when you have tailwinds. But when you're looking for outperformance year over year, environments that are changing, we live in a cyclical business, in the real estate business. And so I think consistent outperformance comes from strong leadership or effective leadership as a foundation, especially in today's environment.
Okay. To anyone listening who thinks that's the type of leader I want to be, but they've got maybe someone in their team who they're struggling to take to water. They're struggling to get these guys on the bus. What's your advice? How have you brought someone who you thought was going to be the most resistant around personal development? How have you got them to get on board with this?
I think either people are in a place where they can align with goals of the company they're working for, or of their, whatever their KPIs are for the year. Either they're on board and they have a common goal or they don't. And I think that's where it's a bit black and white relative to either you're on track to achieve those goals or you're not. And sometimes that's where the hard conversations come in, where it's like you have to be able to give that feedback, identify maybe where people are missing. Feedback's a favor, and be really clear about what they're not giving or what they're not getting on board with. And I would tell you that it's that fear of direct communication oftentimes on behalf of the leader that holds the team back. I would ask, if I'm that leader, if I'm giving them advice, I would ask them whether or not they have clearly communicated where the gaps are or where someone's not getting on board.
Okay. All right. Well, after all that fantastic feedback, Megan, telling you sort of people telling me how great you are, let's try and bring this back down to earth as well a little bit. Let's talk about mistakes. And I'm a big believer, right? We learn from our mistakes. What's been a costly mistake for you? What's been a mistake where you've learned the most from?
First of all, I totally agree. I think your mistakes and your failures are the best and most valuable learning opportunities, and you cannot let them be wasted, right?
Yep.
The biggest mistake, I don't know if there's one in particular, but I would say probably coming into sort of leadership roles early on and doing some of those things that I mentioned, like not showing enough respect to people who have been doing what they've been doing without you for a long time. And then you coming in as a new leader saying, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to change this and I'm going to do that and I'm going to change that. And sort of driving too much change too quickly before you've really built the why or help people understand the why. I'm a Simon Sinek fan. So you talk about start with why.
Yep.
And it's really hard to get people on board to drive change if you can't clearly articulate the why, if the why is something that doesn't resonate with them, and sort of driving too much change too fast without really building the business case and the why has absolutely been something that I've made mistakes with in the past.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on from this. We've talked about what you're responsible for. We've talked about some of your early days. Let's get really deep into the into our mentoring session now. Um, so let's talk about what you look for when you're assessing your team. Maybe when you're assessing a prospective member of that team. What are some of the traits that give you a clue that this person is going to be a great future leader?
Someone who's got a growth mindset, which you and I just touched on,
Hmm.
and someone who sees setbacks as opportunities to grow, someone who can demonstrate the fact that they've lost or failed and then they've rebounded. I always look for objectivity versus subjectivity. I think so many of us we can all put together a case to support a deal we want to do or support our position in an argument. We can sit down, we can articulate, we can build our case, so to speak, to support what's in our best interest.
Hmm.
But do people have the ability to argue both sides or to argue and objectively evaluate something and point out mm, perspectives that are in contrast to what's in their best interest? I look for that. Um, and the ability to, and demonstrating that they want to learn. And you called it curiosity earlier. But I think people who are willing to learn and demonstrate that they want to grow, I think that's a really key piece of it that you can't always teach.
Now, our audience is pretty varied. Real estate investment development's a broad church, right? Um, but so's your experience. When I looked back at this, investment, development, ops, now the president. So, of the roles that you have taken, of the transitions that you have made throughout this, what was the steepest learning curve? What was the hardest for you?
When I transitioned into the head of operations role about 5 years or so ago now, that was my first big jump from being an individual contributor and leading a smaller team
Hmm.
to taking over, the entire West Coast. And that jump included leading very astute professionals on the ground in each of our markets who, in most markets, had more experience there than I did. So that was the steepest learning curve. And that happened at the beginning of COVID, which made it even more challenging because I was trying to lead and build relationships virtually, which I think connecting virtually is great for maintaining existing relationships. It's really hard to connect with people at a deeper level virtually. So I'd say that was the steepest learning curve. And that's where really I had to lean into the sort of approaching each of these people, some of these very senior leaders, through the lens of what can they teach me? Because being an effective leader, I talked about listening, but it also comes back a lot to asking the right questions. And through getting to know people through asking those questions, understanding where they are the subject matter experts, what you can learn from them, and how you then use that to be effective, I think is really important. So I would say taking over a large team of very experienced people, that was a big jump for me. That was a big team.
And how did you get comfortable with that?
It worked really hard, not only to scale
Sounds really
quickly.
simple, doesn't it?
I mean, there's I sort of say the harder I work, the luckier I get,
Yeah.
right? I think there's something to be said for work ethic.
Okay. So let's ask. Well, let's give away to some of these tips then from someone then who we've discovered is very passionate about research and education. What's one book, one resource then that our audience needs to dive into as soon as possible?
There's so many, especially in today's age of so much information. I would say first up, Harvard Business Review is a resource that I use regularly. I have a subscription. I'm always looking for new content. Leadership, there's no finish line in leadership. I'm always working at it and I enjoy it. So I'd say Harvard Business Review is a resource that I use regularly. As far as one book, it's I've talked about feedback. Radical Candor, Kim Scott is a really good one because I think it helps people understand how to give feedback in a direct way that's also supportive. We talked about mindset. I'd say Mindset by Carol Dweck is key to for new leaders because I think losing as an individual contributor is different than sort of losing or failing as a leader, where you got to anchor on resilience and your team is watching you and how you lead them through challenges. It looks differently than how you lead them through wins. So I'd probably say mindsets at the top of that list.
Okay. You introduced some their challenges, and that reminded me. I asked you a question that's very early in this session about what were some of the challenges in the earliest part of the career when you didn't have the title, when people didn't think you were the most senior in the room. Well, we've gone full 180 now, Megan. You've got the title. You are no doubt sort of the most senior in most of these settings. So, what are some of the challenges now? Or what are some of the biggest challenges that affect you today?
I'd say I'm always looking. I'm a big fan of many strategic leadership principles. Like if you ask me what my leadership style is, I align quite a bit with strategic leadership when it comes to, anticipation, right? Seeing around corners, what's coming next? Are we preparing for what hasn't happened yet? You got to stay agile and leading a team in a way that is grounded in consistency, but also um, at the same time very innovative, encouraging people to take risks and to challenge. I think those two things can sometimes be in contrast. So it's anticipating, it's navigating a complex business environment, and then it's leading the team in a way that they are comfortable taking risks and being innovative. I think those are the things that I think about. Challenges, it's funny. I still think of myself as sometimes just, it's just me. I'm just, a teammate just talking to other teammates, but I think it's been sort of adapting and understanding that okay, people see a more senior leader now at times. So I'm always reminding myself what does this person need from me in this moment? It's not about what I need. It's not necessarily about what I think or what I want to tell them. It's what do they need to hear from me in this moment in order to lead them to the best possible performance. It's making that transition that I think is something senior leaders. I think that's another thing that we're not going to cross the finish line. I think you're always sort of on a journey.
Okay. Before we get to wrap this up, Megan, we've talked here a lot about your drivers. We've talked about the skills that you've mastered as well. What about the things that you've had to jettison? What about the traits you've had to quieten as you've climbed this ladder? What are those?
So I love a checklist. I love, like you talked about work ethic. I sort of wake up feeling behind. Like I just get up and I'm ready to go for the day. And I love crossing stuff off my to-do list, as many people do that study
Oh.
productivity. And the more senior you become as a leader, the value of your work isn't in always checking some of those more, you know, mundane tasks off your list.
Mm-hmm.
The value is strategic thinking. The value is strategy. Your time is value and it is finite. It's a finite resource. So what I have to keep myself honest on is where am I spending my time? What does that line up with what we're trying to drive for the business? And if I'm stuck doing a bunch of sort of, you know, tactical work, then that means I'm not spending that time on strategic work. Right. And I
Mm-hmm.
talked about seeing around corners and things. So it's being disciplined about for where you're spending your time and understanding the value and what you need to hand off and delegate. I think that's a really common struggle for a lot of senior leaders, and it's something I'm always trying to perfect. And quite frankly, I reevaluate it even on a quarterly basis, Nick. It's like, where did I spend my time? How did that line up with the results we were able to get? And then what do I need to change going forward? And how am I going to hold myself accountable to that, to saying no to certain things, to delegating certain things, to handing certain things off? I think you have to be really disciplined.
Okay. Well, we talked a lot about things in the background, right? Things in the rearview mirror. Let's turn our attention before we wrap up now then to the future. What are you looking forward to, personally and corporately? You know, sort of for your own career and then sort of the Prologis sort of landscape.
Or what am I looking forward to? Just continuing to drive our team toward consistent outperformance, whatever that means. And each year is going to be different. I can tell you right now, I'm working on 2026. You know, what are our themes? What's our strategy? Where the headwinds going to be in the markets on the
Mm-hmm.
West Coast, and how are we going to navigate those? And by the way, how are we going to exploit those and be opportunistic and take advantage? And I'm just looking forward to continuing to iterate and improve, both personally and then in the context of a business. Innovation is a big piece of what we do, and improving and increasing speed and agility, having an innovative mindset. So I'm looking forward to continuing to iterate into the best version of myself and helping my team do the same.
Fantastic, fantastic. And then on the wider Prologis scene.
We are uh, seeing signs in the market that we've begun a bottoming process when it comes to operating fundamentals. We've seen demand begin to increase. I think we're at the point where we're looking ahead to this next phase of the real estate cycle after we've readjusted post COVID, coming off of what was the strongest market that we'd seen in the industrial sector, leading up to that peak in 2022. So we're looking forward to this next phase of the cycle and how we're going to be able to take advantage. And I would tell you that for us, building a portfolio and deploying capital in a way that really sets us apart from the sector and the peer group is something we've been very intentional about. We're excited to see this portfolio outperform as we look ahead.
Well, on that very positive note, then, Megan, we'll wrap this up. But thank you very much for being so generous with your time, so open here with your own sort of skill set. And I'm no doubt then the future leaders who are tuning into this, will have been scribbling down all your best ready for when it's put into practice. So thank you again for doing it.
Thanks, Nick. It's been fun. I appreciate you having me.